Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, some familiar faces. And thanks especially to Peter Orner. When was it? In August, Peter's book came out and I did a Q&A with him. I'd never met him before in Seattle, and it was great. I've been a fan of his writing for a long time. But it was fun to talk then, and now we'll re-talk again. So thanks. And it's great to be back in San Francisco. This book is, the character in this book, the primary character, the lead character, works for the World Bank, which everyone seems to think is like not a very exciting institution. But I swear, I grew up in Washington, D.C., where we were surrounded by people who worked at places like the World Bank. And it's very dramatic. And so I thought, like, why is no one writing about this stuff? And that's basically how I came to this book. I usually sort of yammer on for a while and then read, but I wanted to not yammer on so long. I'm just going to read a bit, and then Peter and I are going to talk. And the content of what I would have said had I been yammering on initially will come out through our conversation. So I'm just going to read a bit from the opening of the book. This is sort of like a snipped around portion of the first chapter. And the book's called The Dismal Science. The annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF had become a kind of rowdy reunion, bearing increasingly the muffled bonhomie of a great funeral. At the Omni's and Sheridan's dueling bars, aging dignitaries gathered over strong drink and weak gossip. Vincenzo planted himself at the Sheridan Superior Bar, occasionally reading briefs in the comfortable chairs of the adjacent lobby, but otherwise holding to a tight orbit. The younger attendees still handed out business cards, as if there was an angle to be had, as if somebody would remember, as if it meant anything to be remembered. This being 2005, it wasn't lost on anyone that there hadn't been a major economic catastrophe in 5 years, except for Argentina, and that didn't count because their central bank was just too inept for words. So maybe everyone was starting to feel like they'd gotten it right after all, because the proceedings felt buoyed by a confidence that had been absent before, especially during the troubled 90s, when there was a lot of talk of hegemony, a word that hadn't really seemed to exist before, but suddenly became so ubiquitous as to be immediately exhausting. There in the 90s, crises came huge and frequent, each scarier than the last. Executives sharing elevators exchanged wide-eyed looks, as if pining for a return to the relative sanity of the Cold War. Suspicious of this new tranquility, Vincenzo believed it was all the more important to remain vigilant. There was always, anyway, a lurking danger in D.C.'s autumn months. The city's summer torpor lifted unevenly, unpredictably in the fall. In the fall, you'd leave your house in a winter coat, scrape ice off the windshield, and by lunchtime, you'd be turning up the air conditioning. Despite the unpredictability of September, the meetings were fine. Everyone was fine. The protesters didn't even seem that upset. What else, after all, was there to say? In Latin America, things were great, more or less. The World Bank's programs were going swimmingly, and though he was in charge of the region, Vincenzo knew he deserved zero credit for it. No one deserved credit. The medicine had finally taken, that's all. The emerging markets were now actually emerging. It's almost on autopilot, he said, to half-hearted chuckles from the crowd. His panel was in one of the larger halls of the Omni. The room had only filled halfway. During the Q&A, he glanced at the clock, saw that there were 8 minutes left. And what had been said? Nothing. Nothing much was ever said, but they had really said nothing this time. People were transfixed by their phones. At least one of the reporters up front was doodling. She was attractive, or she was young and healthy, and that was attractive. And his recognition of the predictability of his anguish at her boredom was almost as painful as his anguish at her boredom itself. Could it really be so ghastly and predictable? Yes, of course it could. Afterward, He and his co-panelists had a half-hour break before they reconvened in a boardroom upstairs for a closed-door discussion with delegates from the major Latin American economies who wanted to explore their evolving relationship with the wealthy countries that had for so many decades been either, depending on whom you asked, bailing them out of self-inflicted disasters or shoving them into disasters and then charging them for a bailout. In any case, these countries were less feeble now. Something had shifted underfoot. It was time to have a frank conversation. Vincenzo was leaving the first meeting when Cynthia, whom he hadn't seen in at least 10 years, approached with that mischievous, squinting grin. Maybe she'd been embarrassed of her teeth as a kid, which were, in fact, a little crooked, but she always hid them with her lips when smiling. She left the World Bank for some leadership role at the IADB years ago, and now here she was, edging toward him with that odd smirk, saying, "Oh my God, he's alive." Setting his briefcase down on the chair, he grabbed her by the shoulders, kissed her cheeks, and then held her back as if to appraise her. "How the hell are you?" he said. "God, I hate being back here," she said. "I can't walk 10 feet without running into horrible old ghouls like you." He grinned. "But you live here, right?" "Fuck no," she said. "I slid over to the UNDP and they put me in Brazil and hence," she waved her hand vaguely at the room. The new job was, strictly speaking, a step down, which was probably why she hadn't broadcast the switch. She'd gone median middle age. A sexless pall had fallen over her, as it had most of them, as it had, no doubt, him. Back when they'd had their affair, when they were on mission in Peru, she had an impressive body for a mother of 3 in her 40s, and her aura was distinctly sensual. She radiated low-frequency sexual enticement. There was something in the body language, the way she sat down so slowly, how long she held your hand during a handshake, the over-determined eye contact, even her coy grin seemed dangerous. You just knew she was a pervert. Now she was, probably in her late 50s, more battle horse than colt. The carnality had dimmed, or maybe it was still there and his sensing mechanism was damaged. Worse still, maybe she just didn't turn the signal on for him anymore. "Look, we should have a drink," he said. "I have another meeting." The last of the others were filing out. "I'm going to be at that meeting," she said. "Oh, you're going to be upstairs?" "Yes," she said. "We should go to the Sheraton after." He nodded. She smiled a little and then added, "If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, don't think that." He snorted, and then he slowly drew a deep breath, shook his head, and looked away. Since he didn't deny it, she said, "Do you still want to have that drink?" He paused for effect, looked her in the eye, and said, as unconvincing as possible, "Of course I do." She chuckled humorlessly, no doubt weary of men like him. It was only once they were in the elevator going up that it dawned on him that this wasn't really a coincidence. She didn't have a good reason to be at either of the meetings. No, she was angling for something, maybe a job. They were not alone in the elevator, but he could smell Cynthia's perfume, too sweet, too conspicuous, too much honeysuckle. It brought back a sour stain of guilt, all the worse now that he'd lost the reason for that guilt. Perhaps sensing where he was, she said, "How's your kid?" He squinted at her. This not mentioning of his wife, he didn't quite know what to make of it. Maybe she hadn't heard. Probably she had. Either way, he wouldn't bring it up. "She finished college and is in New York." Cynthia nodded. "She's a waitress," he added, "lots of tattoos." She smiled in the repressed way people do in elevators, in the way she always did. "Your husband?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Great." He nodded, but she wasn't even wearing a ring. There wasn't even a tan line. 2 hours later, at the Sheraton's vast bar, he and Cynthia parked in a pair of stools, the afternoon light gloaming at the distant window, and she told him about Brazil, her residence, and so on. Apparently she'd been unfairly pushed out of her last job. Neither mentioned their families. It was an hour before she finally got around to the thing that she'd sought him out to discuss. The bank had tried a series of partnerships with private mobile phone providers throughout Latin America to get more cell towers built in poor areas. But the mobile phone companies hadn't been incentivized properly, and the rural customers hadn't understood how to partake. Ultimately, it was still too expensive to figure out. They'd hoped to get internet to tiny schools in the Amazon, etc. It could have been great, but it wasn't great. So Vincenzo cut everyone's losses and killed it. In each country, the money was rolled into a general project fund, a bureaucratic purgatory for failed ideas. Cynthia wanted to try it again in Brazil through the UNDP, but Vincenzo had been so adamant in mothballing the phone project that no one would be interested in taking it up again. I have ideas for how to fix it, she said. She began to lay out her ideas when he stopped her. It was a nice idea in theory, but so unseemly. If it worked, highlighting the bank's failure. If it failed, they'd all look foolish to the Brazilians. In any case, he'd be letting a different organization plagiarize the bank's work. Still, it was a nice idea in theory. In a better world, maybe. To change the subject, he said, "Where are you staying while you're here?" "Vincenzo, I remarried," she said. "Then why aren't you wearing a ring?" he said, and cast an eye at her hand. "I could ask you the same," she said. He nodded. Later, back at her hotel room, they had sex, and it was about as exciting as running on a treadmill before breakfast. She had put condoms on the bedside table, as if there were any danger of pregnancy or STDs. They didn't use them, thank God. Still, his mind wandered as he stared at her body beneath him, her breasts spilling over her rib cage, sloshing like half-filled sacks of water. Still, she had insisted on leaving the lights on, which was a terrible idea for people like them. Despite her best efforts, the whole thing was just carpentry. There had been more passion between them when they hugged earlier, but he had to see it through. Her milky belly, the familiar but foreign manner she had with him, her feeble groans. He observed it all from the far side of a very great chasm. Eventually, just as he was about to fake an orgasm, something happened. The depleted hormones or swaddled synapses, or was it just a dormant part of his soul? Whatever had been absent before came back, lit up all at once. He grabbed her hips and she squealed in delight. He soon finished and collapsed beside her, panting, his pulse throbbing in his skull. She gasped and then burst out laughing. "Wow," she said. He grunted, nodding in agreement. "That was impressive," she said. Yes, it was impressive. Life, again, had just been hiding somewhere, waiting for an invitation. Afterward, once he had recovered, they put on the hotel bathrobes and opened a bottle of Pinot Grigio. Outside D.C. was empty, awash in the sickly orange light of 1,000 failing streetlights. It was his turn to talk. He had decided he should confess that his wife had died. It was, he muttered and halted, searching for the next word and slowly nodding until eventually he stopped nodding. Thank you. I'll stop there.